again. Remember, it was just a couple of years ago, Ayman Moeldin, when Erdogan's security guards on American soil in Washington beat up peaceful protesters as Erdogan watched. Charges were dropped. Time and again, this president gives a pass to Erdogan. But let's talk about what's happening on the ground. This surprise, not just to the SDF, but to allies around the world, to the Pentagon, to the State Department, the surprise decision. Imagine you're the commander in the field leading the SDF. You get a call, according to Carol Lee's reporting at NBC News, at 3 a.m. yesterday morning, basically to stand down and that American troops are leaving your side. A complete surprise to that commander.
Yeah, and the first thing that you're probably thinking of is that all your troops and all the people that you've had on the front lines are now exposed in some way, shape, or form. They're either going to be exposed from the Turkish side, that the Turks could possibly begin shelling certain positions inside Syria. They could even advance. And there's all kinds of calculations the Turks have to go through before they take on that risk. But essentially, the green light has been given for them to at least begin some kind of remote airstrikes, as we've seen in the past. But also what it does is it upends the kind of quiet norm that had been existing, because the Syrian government and their Russian backers have made clear that they wouldn't tolerate any invasion or any military operation by Turkey in Syrian sovereign territory. So the Syrian government now is making a calculation. They're going to try to win over the Kurds. They're going to try to offer them some kind of concession to bring them back into the fold, to keep the integrity of that country in place. And so you could see yourself once again opening another between Turkey and Syria. You talked about the fact that President Erdogan has snubbed President Trump on many times, including most recently when the American military told Turkey, do not buy those Russian surface-to-air missiles. That was a very big decision. And what did Turkey do? They totally snubbed the Americans by saying, no, we will continue to buy these Russian surface-to-air missiles, despite the fact that NATO and America said no. And what does President Trump do? A couple weeks after that decision, he turns around and grants Turkey something they've been pushing for years, a green light to attack Kurds inside Syria.
So, Elise, let's talk about the relationship between Presidents Trump and Erdogan. The White House announced President Trump's pullout shortly after his phone call with President Erdogan. It marks the second time in less than a year that President Trump announced a major troop withdrawal from Syria immediately following a phone call with Erdogan. Those are just two instances in a trend in which Erdogan has had his way with President Trump. In May of 2017, as I mentioned, just minutes after a meeting with Trump in the Oval Office, Erdogan was seen on camera ordering his security detail to assault a group of peaceful protesters on Embassy Row in Washington, American protesters. Trump still has not commented on that incident, and charges against the Turkish assailants were quietly dropped later. As Ayman mentioned, this past July, Turkey officially took shipment of Russian air defense systems against the protests of the White House. The Trump administration ejected Turkey from the F-35 fighter jet program in response. However, President Trump has declined to implement sanctions, which were threatened and would be warranted for buying Russian-made defense systems. As for Sunday, NBC News has learned from 3 current and former officials that the call initially was instigated to quell Erdogan's growing rage over not getting a sit-down with President Trump last month at the United Nations General Assembly. So the reporting NBC News has is that basically Donald Trump was trying to get Erdogan off the phone because Erdogan was mad that he didn't get to have a one-on-one with him here in New York a couple of weeks ago, and said, okay, go into Syria.
The art of the deal. So what exactly is America, is our national interest getting from this rash decision that Donald Trump makes? Because apparently he wants to get an authoritarian that he lets do whatever he wants otherwise, even on U.S. soil. Go ahead. This process, I'd like to compare and contrast a little bit with the Afghan peace negotiations. You have actually, whatever you think of the deal that was being worked out, you had a year-long process, and it was a serious process. And 2 warring factions were going to move to the next stage and go to Oslo. You have Donald Trump, though, insert himself into the process, boom, it blows up.
But there was one similarity between the two that is really uncomfortable. In both cases, we totally undermine our friend. We ignored the Afghan
democratically elected government,
which had been our ally, and now we've ignored the Kurds. What does this say if you're an American ally? We will just turn on you. It means nothing, and instead we will placate our foes. The consequences of this are big, and they're lasting, and they're global. As bad as they are for the Middle East, they are conceivably even worse for the entire world.
So let's bring in one of the authors of that NBC News report I've been mentioning, Carol Lee. Carol, good morning. Walk us through this decision-making process. The president said yesterday, quote, "I consulted with everybody." That was his blanket response when asked who helped him make this decision. "I consulted with everybody." That's not borne out in your reporting. Tell us about why President Erdogan was so upset, and the president, according to your report, Trump tried to smooth it over by saying, yes, I'll get our people out of the way so you can go into Turkey.
Right. Well, the backdrop to the phone call between President Erdogan and President Trump was the UN General Assembly meeting that didn't happen between the two of them. Erdogan, according to our sources, felt very slighted. That he only saw President Trump at a larger reception for a number of world leaders, and they had minimal time together. And so the goal was for the president to try to smooth things over. And they discussed, a missile defense system. They discussed a safe zone in Syria. President Trump offered a White House visit to President Erdogan. And then the conversation kind of went off the track. And Erdogan was very determined, according to people we talked to, that he was going into Syria, that he was finally just going to take this action. And the president basically said, according to people we talked to, okay, fine, you can do something moderate, but if you do something large scale, that's not going to be okay. They hang up the phone. The chief of staff calls the defense secretary to inform him of this decision. And then the White House scrambles to put out a statement. And meanwhile, in the middle of the night in Syria, U.S. troops who are in the area of which they wanted to pull back some of these forces, and so they didn't get in the way of anything that Turkey was doing, gets an urgent message saying we are departing the field. And at 3 a.m., the commander of the Syrian Democratic Forces gets a phone call, says you need to get on a video conference call with a senior American commander, who then informs him of this presidential decision. And so you kind of see it unravel from there. And then there's confusion in Washington, in European capitals, across the Middle East, and no one really knows exactly what the decision is. And you've seen in the last 24 hours the president's tweets, the statements coming out of the White House. They're saying, no, the president really was against Erdogan going into Turkey. He does not support this. He only pulled back because Erdogan was determined and it was going to happen anyways. And there's really no clarity on what the policy is today going forward.
So President Trump's decision to pull troops from northern Syria is once again raising questions about his business dealings. As the Washington Post points out, the first person to suggest that Donald Trump would have a conflict of interest in dealing with Turkey and Turkish President Erdogan was actually Trump himself. Here he is back in 2015.
Well, I have a little conflict of interest because I have a major building in Istanbul, and it's a tremendously successful job. It's called Trump Towers, 2 towers instead of 1. Not the usual 1, it's 2. And I've gotten to know Turkey very well, and they're amazing people. They're incredible people. They have a strong leader.
They have a strong leader.
The Post notes that both Donald Trump and his daughter Ivanka traveled to Turkey when the Trump Organization launched the Trump Towers project there. In 2012, Donald Trump tweeted celebrations of the project several times while there. And Ivanka Trump, who is now a senior official in the White House, tweeted at the time, "Thank you, Prime Minister Erdogan, for joining us yesterday to celebrate the launch of Trump Towers Istanbul."
So, Tom Nichols, Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein used to say, follow the money. What we've been saying since Trump got into the White House was, if you don't understand his foreign policy, it's not really difficult to figure out. Follow the money, whether it's in Istanbul, whether it's in Russia, whether it's in the Philippines, wherever it is. Saudi Arabia, chances are good these are countries that have strong men or authoritative governments that have piled money into Donald Trump's public, into his account in the past. And this is not a surprise. He